Hello, everyone, and welcome to another VMblog expert interview series. And today we're excited to speak with Elad Ben-Israel, who is the CEO and co-founder of Winglang. I know this is the first time you and I have been on a show like this together, so it's great to have you.
Great to be here, man.
As a startup guy myself, it's pretty interesting and exciting to hear that Winglang just launched out of stealth mode back in July with $20 million in seed funding. Can you provide some background on the company and maybe talk about its mission?
Sure. Our mission is to make the cloud a better place to build software, basically. And we were able to partner up with some really great investors and advisors and team to take on this really challenging task, because the problem, as we see it, the problem is fundamental. There's a mismatch between the tools that we're using to build cloud applications today and the cloud platform that we're actually targeting. And so we really want to solve this problem from the ground up, pun intended, of course. And fix a lot of the fundamental pains that we see both in developers' experience when they're building for the cloud, their ability to stay in the flow and iterate quickly and leverage the cloud in their code, and for organizations using the cloud, where we see a lot of basically overhead around delivering for the cloud, and a lot of duplication across the industry, a lot of non-differentiated efforts, across many companies. And so we're trying to go back to first principles in a way and solve the cloud development problem.
Now, there's a lot of interest around your open source programming language, Winglang. Can you explain what makes this programming language unique and how it impacts Kubernetes users?
So the unique thing about Winglang is that it allows developers to express both infrastructure and runtime code together in the same language. Languages that we use today, or tools that we use today to build for the cloud, they're focused usually on one of those two things. Either you're using an infrastructure as a code tool like CDK or Pulumi or CloudFormation or any other tool, or Terraform, or you use a programming language that tells one machine what to do every time. And so if you think about cloud applications, we're no longer in a world where you're just programming a single machine. You're programming this distributed system that has all these services and resources working together to deliver value, right, to users. And because of that, you basically need both. You basically need both the infrastructure definitions, the architectural connectivity and how these things behave from an infrastructure perspective, but you also need to specify exactly what each compute element is doing within that system. And one of the things that I learned as I've been building the CDK at Amazon the past 5 years there, and I've realized that you can't have one without the other, and you really need, as a developer, you really want to be able to express them both together, because they're really tightly coupled. The more an application leans on the cloud and uses cloud resources to achieve its goals, the more the application code depends on the infrastructure. And if you have these two separate universes, you end up with a lot of the pain that we see in the cloud comes from these two different universes that need to connect together. And the Kubernetes angle is really interesting to me, because I feel Kubernetes has been kind of causing users to be containerized in a way, developers to be containerized. It kind of created this situation where developers, the folks that are actually building the business logic, the stuff that actually creates value to the business directly, it kind of created a situation where they're responsible only for what containers are doing. And to me, that's not the cloud. To me, that's basically a small piece of a big story. And when you're using Kubernetes, the structure of the system and the complexity of the technology and many other reasons, we can go into that if you want. But when you're using Kubernetes, you end up in a situation where developers are not really empowered to use the cloud directly. They're kind of confined into the. That's why I say they're kind of containerized. And so what we're trying to do with Wing is we're trying to create the unified model that doesn't care if something is running inside your Kubernetes cluster or is running outside of your cluster, if it's running on a serverless compute platform or a containerized container orchestration system, or if it's using buckets, or if it uses some services that run inside your Kubernetes cluster. So the boundaries between your Kubernetes cluster and the cloud, they fade away. And that basically gives back developers the ability to harness the cloud as I think it should have, how it should be harnessed, for its economic value, of transferring responsibilities and using managed services and resources.
Now, we're, talking about the trade show KubeCon, CloudNativeCon. For event attendees, maybe you can describe a little bit about how your company fits within that ecosystem that's being discussed here at the show.
So we're actually launching a container support with simulator support for KubeCon, and I'm very excited about this because I think Kubernetes is an amazing production tool, and I think as a container orchestration system is incredibly powerful. But I don't think that it's an amazing development tool. And I've been talking to developers, hundreds of companies in the past year, and what you see is a really strong pattern of developers really not interested in understanding exactly how Kubernetes works, because it doesn't provide value to their work, right? Like direct to their work. It provides value to the production environment where it's able to scale what they've done, based on, the capacity that is required, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the key architectural principles of Wing is this decoupling between application and platform. And when you're using containers in Wing, you're basically describing long-running services. And so you can basically say, I want this long-running service to connect to these resources and to take requests from this endpoint and to perform these operations. And so you're describing your system from an application perspective, which means that you don't necessarily need to care if you're running on Kubernetes or you're running on any other container orchestration system or any other thing that can run your long-running service. And one of the things that we're launching as part of this feature is support for Kubernetes as a way to run long-running services, if that makes sense. And so it creates this decoupling that allows developers to focus on the functionality of their application and to develop locally using the Wing simulator, which is, a local tool that allows them to actually run their entire cloud application locally, including containers. So it's not just about starting containers, it's also about connecting them with the cloud buckets and queues and any other resources that their containers are interacting with, as I said, in a unified model. But then when you go and deploy your application, you can choose to deploy them on, let's say, EKS using Helm. And so it gives both developers and platform teams the ability to control what they want at the right level. And we think it's interesting because it actually, it's based on what we hear from developers, right? Like on this decoupling that we hear that developers really want. And the existing tooling are not really providing. They're very leaky in a sense.
Now, yeah, I mean, I think that's cool. And I know that here at KubeCon in Chicago, you're actually launching what you just talked about, the Wing simulator, and it's helping developers build and test their Kubernetes applications. But you talked about it a little bit, but maybe can you go in maybe a bit deeper and talk about how it exactly works and maybe what some of the benefits are that people may not yet be aware of because it's brand new. You're just now launching.
Yeah. So basically, and again, the beauty of this capability is that it's the same as any other resources that we've been launching for Wing in the past year. And the way Wing works is it has this concept of platforms. And so when you're writing Wing code, you're not explicitly specifying, unless you want to, but you don't have to explicitly specify what platform this application is running on. And before we talk about containers, if you're just talking about other types of cloud resources that Wing support, like a bucket, for example. And so if you use a cloud bucket in Wing, you're not specifying that you want this to be an S3 bucket or an Azure bucket or a Dropbox directory for that matter, right? Like, so anything that adheres to the interface of that bucket can be used as a backing implementation when you're deploying it to the cloud. And so what we've done with containers is exactly the same thing. Right? We said, okay, what's the mental model of a developer when they're using containers? They want to specify the Docker image that they're using or the Docker file that they're using, and it's going to take care of building those Docker images and pushing them, and all the mechanics that are required in order to deliver those images to the cloud so that they can be used. And so the image, the number of replicas, auto scaling capabilities, environment variables, all the usual suspects of like defining a containerized workload. And then when you're running them, when you're compiling them to run within the Wing simulator, those containers are going to just start locally in your machine using Docker, because all you need in order to actually use these containers to develop these containerized applications locally is Docker, right? In most cases. In some cases, there are applications that depend on the Kubernetes cluster's capabilities, and you can actually use Wing with CDK for Kubernetes, but that's a different topic, I guess. But all you need is to run these containers. And the interesting thing is that, people have been doing that, right? Like people have been doing that with Docker Compose, or even manually with Docker Run, or just running their applications locally in the machine. But where they're struggling is when these containers are actually interacting in a larger system. And so these containers might interact with other microservices within the application or with other cloud resources within these applications that are not even containers, right? Like, God forbid, they're actually things that are not inside my Kubernetes cluster, but they're part of my application. And so, as I said earlier, this unified model gives developers the ability to actually spin up their entire cloud application locally within the simulator and write tests that are end-to-end, so they can trigger the API endpoint and check that the bucket had some information written to it and that the queue picked that up. And so they can actually write tests, unit tests that run during build without having to provision a Kubernetes cluster, without having to understand what Kubernetes is even. But then when they go and deploy that, then these containerized workloads become Helm charts. And they deploy through Terraform, or you could actually customize a lot of the platform side of Wing, right? Like Wing has this really customizable platform layer, and the built-in platform that we're shipping with Wing, at least the initial release, is going to support EKS and Helm, and we've seen that a lot, across the industry. But there's nothing that prohibits you from using any other Kubernetes technology.
Now, a bit earlier, I may have heard wrong, but it sounds like you feel that Kubernetes users aren't taking full advantage of the cloud. Do I have that right? And then if that's true, like, how should developers and DevOps, change how they approach using Kubernetes?
I worked at AWS for many years, and I think it's an interesting kind of like cultural engineering, cultural conversation, right? Like what's happening? How is this cloud? How this thing we call cloud evolved? And so I'm biased probably, right? Like, given that I spent so many years at Amazon, and but I do think Amazon is right, to be honest, right? Like, I do think that foundational idea behind the cloud is the economies of being able to not do something, right? Like to actually hand over responsibilities to other cloud services and focus more on my business. And so if I want to use an object store, for example, that's a simple example, so I'm going to use that. But if I want to use an object store, if I want to store some objects on the cloud, I can go and pay Amazon some money, and they take care of storing this data on their servers and scaling that and making sure they're replicated and backed up and whatever, right? Encrypted. Or I can go and deploy min.io into my Kubernetes cluster, and then I have to become have to manage these min.io instances on my cluster and manage the hard drives and make sure that I have it replicated. And so I end up having to spend, as a company, as an organization using Kubernetes, have to spend a lot of energy on something that's absolutely not my my business. And so that's a simple example, but it carries forward to like every other type of service that exists in the cloud ecosystem. And I'm not even talking just services that are within the cloud provider's ecosystem. I'm talking about the wide open ecosystem of software as a service solutions that people can use in order to build stuff. And what I've seen is that I've seen Kubernetes shops, people who are like avid Kubernetes, platform teams or DevOps teams. They have this mentality of like, I want everything to be inside my cluster. And I was trying to understand why is that mentality? Why does it make sense for them to have that mentality? And I can totally relate to where they're coming from, because Kubernetes is an amazing tool. And so they want everything to be a nail, right? Like they have this amazing hammer and they want everything to be a nail. They want to shove everything to the cluster because that's how they can manage their versioning and rollout and GitOps, and everything just like falls into place beautifully. But the reality is that it doesn't make economic sense to actually put all of that stuff into the cluster. And so I've never seen almost anyone that only uses Kubernetes, right? Like we've seen Kubernetes is everywhere. And as I said, I think it's an amazing technology and super powerful production tool. But I've also seen that any company that uses Kubernetes also uses other services. And the result of that is that those other services, they become second-class citizens within the production environment, within the deployment environment, right? Like those are not first-class citizens because they're outside of the cluster. And so the result is that you see these companies not leveraging a lot of the amount of cloud resources these companies leverage is much smaller than if you look at companies that are using the cloud in a different way, or using Kubernetes in a different way. There are other ways to use Kubernetes that are not necessarily purist. And so I think like that's kind of like where we're coming from in that sense. Like we're saying the cloud is this heterogeneous, amazing place, and we want to make sure that everything is first-class citizen, and both containers and buckets, and they have the same place, right, in the programming model and in the deployment model and in the operational model. And so that's in a sense what we're trying to do in our relationship to Kubernetes.
Now, you provided a lot of great information, but obviously I want folks to come learn even more about Wingcloud and your technology. I know you're at KubeCon. First, how can folks who are attending the show find you? And then secondly, for the folks who couldn't attend, but they're watching this video at home, where's the best place they can go if they want to learn more about the company and the technology and the things we talked about today?
So we're going to be at booth P39 at KubeCon. I'd love to hang out and chat and show some demos and hack together and geek out together and argue about why we need a programming language or why all of that stuff. Basically meet people, anybody that's interested. And I think the best place to find in more information is winglang.io. Is the website for the Wing programming language, is where most of our focus is right now. There's a really awesome Slack community around the project. So we'd love to see you all there. I'm available there at any time. Feel free to ping me. And that's it.
Great. Well, I appreciate getting the chance to talk to you, and I'll be checking out your booth at the trade show.
Cool. That'll be great.
All right.
Thank you.